12 publishers said no. 12 different ways of saying that a story about a boy wizard wasn't worth publishing. The manuscript that would eventually sell over 500 million copies worldwide was rejected so many times that most writers would have given up. But Joanne Rowling didn't give up. And the reason why changed everything we thought we knew about timing, rejection, and when dreams are supposed to come true. This is 1995. Joanne Rowling, she hadn't yet become J.K., is a single mother living in Edinburgh, Scotland. Her circumstances couldn't be more challenging. She's recently divorced, essentially broke, and raising her infant daughter Jessica alone. She's living on welfare benefits, writing in cafes because her flat is too cold to work in. But here's what's remarkable. In the middle of this chaos, Joanne is carrying around a story that feels more real to her than her own difficult reality. The idea for Harry Potter had come to her 4 years earlier during a delayed train journey from Manchester to London. She'd spent the entire 4-hour delay imagining this boy who didn't know he was a wizard, who lived with relatives who didn't understand him, who was waiting for his real life to begin. For 4 years, Joanne had been developing this world in notebooks, on napkins, on scraps of paper. She'd mapped out 7 books, created detailed character backstories, and invented the rules of magic. But having a story and getting it published are completely different challenges. The completed manuscript for the first book was 90,000 words, typed on an old manual typewriter. Joanne couldn't afford multiple copies, so she had to carefully select which publishers to approach. She started with what seemed like the most logical choices, major publishers who specialized in children's books. The first rejection came quickly. A form letter that thanked her for her submission but explained that the story wasn't quite right for their list. The second rejection was more personal but equally discouraging. The editor suggested that the book was too long for children and too childish for adults. The third rejection stung the most. The publisher said the story was derivative and that fantasy books for children weren't commercially viable. By the 6th rejection, Joanne began to wonder if she was deluding herself. Maybe the story that felt so vivid and important to her was actually mediocre. Maybe 12-year-old Jessica was the only person who would ever care about Harry Potter. Here's what those publishers couldn't see. Joanne wasn't just writing a children's book. She was writing her way through the most difficult period of her life. Every day she spent with Harry Potter was a day she didn't have to think about unpaid bills, about the uncertainty of her future, about whether she was failing as a mother by pursuing this seemingly impossible dream. Harry's story of being underestimated, of not fitting in, of discovering he had powers he didn't know he possessed. It wasn't just fantasy. It was Joanne's lived experience, transformed into something universal. But rejection after rejection was taking its toll. Joanne was seriously considering giving up. The manuscript was sitting in a drawer. She'd stopped checking the mail with hope and started checking it with dread. Her friends were gently suggesting that maybe it was time to be realistic. Maybe it was time to focus on finding a steady job instead of chasing a fantasy that clearly wasn't going to happen. The 10th rejection came with feedback that almost broke her completely. The editor wrote that the story was too slow to start and that children don't want to read about school. Joanne later said that night was the closest she came to throwing away 7 years of work. But something inside her refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe it was something deeper. A certainty that this story mattered, regardless of whether anyone else could see it yet. She decided to try smaller publishers, companies that might be willing to take risks that the big houses wouldn't. The 11th rejection came from a small London publisher, professional but firm. Not for us. The 12th rejection almost didn't happen at all. Joanne had heard about a tiny publishing house called Bloomsbury. They were known for literary fiction, not children's books. It seemed like a long shot, but she had nothing left to lose. Barry Cunningham was the editor who pulled Joanne's manuscript from the pile of submissions. Later, he would say that he almost didn't read it. Fantasy wasn't Bloomsbury's strength. Children's books weren't their focus. Everything about the submission seemed wrong for their list. But something about the opening pages caught his attention. The voice, the specificity of the world, the way magical elements were grounded in recognizable emotions. He took the manuscript home over the weekend. On Monday morning, he called Joanne. But here's the thing about that phone call. Cunningham wasn't calling to offer a massive deal. He wasn't promising bestseller status or movie rights. He was offering a £1,500 advance, barely enough to live on for a few months. He was suggesting a small print run. He was warning Joanne that children's books rarely made much money. But he was also saying something that Joanne had been waiting 7 years to hear. We believe in this story. Here's what's fascinating about that moment. Joanne's story wasn't fundamentally different when Bloomsbury accepted it than it had been when 12 other publishers rejected it. Matter of fact, the words were the same, the plot was the same, Harry Potter was the same character he'd always been. What had changed was that the story had finally found someone who was ready to see what Joanne had been seeing all along. We know how the rest of the story goes. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was published in June 1997 with a first print run of just 1,000 copies. By the end of the year, it had won multiple awards and was being translated into dozens of languages. 7 books later, the Harry Potter series had become the best-selling book series in history. The movies made billions. Joanne Rowling went from welfare benefits to becoming one of the wealthiest women in Britain. Maybe someone watching this needs to hear this today. Maybe you're carrying around something, a dream, a project, an idea that keeps getting rejected. Maybe you're starting to wonder if all those no's are the universe telling you to give up. Joanne's story reminds us that rejection isn't always about quality. Sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes it's about finding the right person who's ready for what you're offering. The difference between a dream that dies and a dream that changes the world might not be talent or luck or connections. It might just be refusing to let rejection number 12 be the last word. Because maybe your story is perfect exactly as it is. Maybe it's just waiting for someone who's ready to see what you've been seeing all along. Maybe the right yes is still out there, waiting for you to be brave enough to ask one more time. The question is, will you let rejection define what's possible? Or will you let it guide you toward the person who's been waiting for exactly what you have to offer? Sometimes the best things in life aren't about perfect timing. Sometimes they're about perfect persistence.